on 6th of September live from a fire station. And more importantly, the messages we've been getting from members, loud and clear, how important this issue is, how high up the agenda for firefighters, understanding this link and doing something about it is. We've seen the engagement in every corner of the FRS. We're seeing the posters going up, we're seeing the tweets, we've seen people with their babies wearing Decon stickers. The training is being taken, the pledge is being signed, and we're getting requests for more information, more posters all of the time. We're also seeing the registry that we've launched starting to be filled out by firefighters, and we're seeing that data build up so we can understand even more going forwards about this link between cancer and firefighting, which we know affects everyone in the fire rescue service in one way or another.
Now, you mentioned the Firefighters Cancer Registry. It's a huge part of getting the really vital data, but one of the questions we keep getting asked is the registry for firefighters who've already been diagnosed with cancer, or should all serving members fill it out?
Look, I can't be clearer on this, Tam. We need every single firefighter to fill out that registry, whether you've been diagnosed with a cancer, whether you've been diagnosed with a disease, or if you've never been diagnosed with anything. We need you to fill out that registry. Now, we've said throughout this project, the launch in September was only the start. There is so much more we need to understand about the link between cancer, disease and the occupation of firefighting. We mentioned in the launch, we heard from colleagues and comrades from abroad how other parts of the world are ahead of us on this issue. They understand more, and the reason they understand more than us is because they have the data, and they get that data from registries such as the one the Fire Brigades Union has now launched together with the University of Central Lancashire. We cannot protect ourselves from this danger if we don't properly understand it, and we can't properly evidence it, and we simply cannot do that unless firefighters fill out that registry. So I'll repeat it because it's so important. Whether you've been diagnosed with a cancer or whether you're completely healthy, if you've been to specific incidents, we've got statisticians and scientists and toxicologists monitoring this data, and they're finding it particularly interesting from incidents such as Grenfell. They're finding that data really, really helpful. Every single firefighter needs to fill this out, and they need to fill it out quickly so we can start this life-saving work that we need to be getting into place.
Well, no, absolutely. But it's not just the registry, is it? I mean, Decon has got a number of initiatives that members can get involved in. Can you speak about that? What else can members do to involve themselves in the campaign?
Absolutely. And in the short term, the most important thing members and firefighters can do is take the training. They can find the training on the Fire Brigades Union website. They should talk to their FBU health and safety rep to find out if it's being delivered by their fire and rescue service yet, which many fire and rescue services are doing, I'm pleased to say, through their official training. If the posters aren't up, get the posters up around your workplace, not just on the health and safety board. Get them in the relevant parts of the station where we need to be reminded most about what it is we must be doing to keep ourselves and each other safe. As we've already mentioned, fill out the registry as a priority. This project is continuing. We need that data. Fill out the registry as a priority. And when I say the project is continuing, we've said throughout, we said it from the launch, this is just the start. There's more we need to understand and there's more we need to do. We're expecting more research to be published very soon as a result of this project by University of Central Lancashire, commissioned by the Fire Brigades Union. And it's going to change the way we look at firefighting. It's going to change the way we look at the risk presented to us as firefighters by these toxic fire effluents. So keep an eye on the Fire Brigades Union social media, keep an eye on the Fire Brigades Union website, because there's more coming very soon, and we will be informing members of exactly what that is as and when it happens.
Riccardo, thanks very much. Well, for more information on this life-saving campaign, and indeed all the campaigns that the FBU is running, you can go to our website, and that's www.fbu.org.uk. Of course, for more immediate updates, you can follow us on Twitter, and that's simply at FBU National. Till next time, thanks for joining us, and Riccardo, thanks very much.
Worldwide studies, especially in Canada and the US, show that 67% of line-of-duty firefighters die from cancer. Yet, if you go to Europe, and specifically in the UK, there are almost non-existing studies in that subject. The main aim of the project we do is to look at contamination issues and approaches and decontamination methods. The project was commissioned by the Fire Brigades Union. That led to the creation of the Firefighters Cancer and Disease Registry. The main aim is to identify link between firefighters' exposure to the occupational cancer. If we do not have firefighters participating, we will be not able to provide preventative health screening, support educational information that will actually be directly related to UK firefighters' health. Fire produces two different groups of fire effluents. Acute toxicants, which would have immediate effect and single exposure, something like carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide. But fire will also produce chronic toxicants. Chronic toxicants is usually low concentrations of toxicants but are produced in every single fire or most of the fires. And the best example would be polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's your polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So if you look at the soot, as you can see, there are tiny particulates just absorbed on the walls. So you can imagine how easy that would be to inhale. And the other intake of those toxins will be through the dermal intake, which is through the skin absorption. So if you're sweating, your temperature body increase. Anything what you've got on the surface, the dermal intake of absorption through the skin will be increased. Some of the studies suggested that if you've got body temperature increase of 5 degrees, there is dermal intake increased by 400%. Once you've got those toxins in a system, some of them will be eliminated, but some of them, because of the big structure that they've got, chemical structure that they have, they will be stored in fat and tissue. And within the years, when you build up all of them, they will deliver and lead to a cancer. The first really dominant cancer is the skin cancer, which indicates that skin is not necessarily protected, and therefore most of the toxicants are taken through the dermal intake. My main message to firefighters would be, please be aware of contaminants. Keep in mind that even if you cannot see them, they will be still there during and few hours after the fire. Worldwide studies, especially in Canada and the US, show that 67% of line-of-duty firefighters die from cancer. Yet, if you go to Europe, and specifically in the UK, there are almost non-existing studies in that subject. The main aim of the project we do is to look at contamination issues and approaches and decontamination methods. The project was commissioned by the Fire Brigades Union. That led to the creation of the Firefighters Cancer and Disease Registry. The main aim is to identify link between firefighters' exposure to the occupational cancer. If we do not have firefighters participating, we will be not able to provide preventative health screening, support educational information that will actually be directly related to UK firefighters' health. Fire produces two different groups of fire effluents. Acute toxicants, which would have immediate effect and single exposure, something like carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide. But fire will also produce chronic toxicants. Chronic toxicants is usually low concentrations of toxicants but are produced in every single fire or most of the fires. And the best example would be polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's your polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. So if you look at the soot, as you can see, there are tiny particulates just absorbed on the walls. So you can imagine how easy that would be to inhale. And the other intake of those toxins will be through the dermal intake, which is through the skin absorption. So if you're sweating, your temperature body increase. Anything what you've got on the surface, the dermal intake of absorption through the skin will be increased. Some of the studies suggested that if you've got body temperature increase of 5 degrees, there is dermal intake increased by 400%. Once you've got those toxins in a system, some of them will be eliminated, but some of them, because of the big structure that they've got, chemical structure that they have, they will be stored in fat and tissue. And within the years, when you build up all of them, they will deliver and lead to a cancer. The first really dominant cancer is the skin cancer, which indicates that skin is not necessarily protected, and therefore most of the toxicants are taken through the dermal intake. My main message to firefighters would be, please be aware of contaminants. Keep in mind that even if you cannot see them, they will be still there during and few hours after the fire.
When I was doing the cancer survey that the Fire Brigade Union sent to all existing firefighters who'd left, either retired or who had left, I was filling it out and it was asking me questions about what I had done when I was a firefighter. And, you know, as I was answering them, I was thinking, crikey, you know, I'd go to a fire and unless it was a really big fire where I was really hot and sweaty, I would still jump back in the machine with all my tunic on, with my smoke hood on. You wouldn't go back to the station and necessarily have a shower because, you know, it wasn't very often that you take the fire engine off the run because you were dirty. We'd get out of a fire and we would eat and we would drink with, you know, soot and smoke and all sorts all over our hands, our faces, my hair. And I was answering these questions and thinking, oh, you know, there's something that perhaps I could have done differently.
You may not be washing your hands today, but in 10, 15 years' time, you may well have that cancer. Now I'm all over it like a rash. You know, you've got to have that PPE. The PPE is provided, and if it's provided, then we've got to be using it. You've got to look after yourselves.
When you're young, you don't think these things are going to ever affect you. You know, young firefighter, done my training, fit as, going to be able to do loads of things.
It's not just that big red glowy thing inside the house that's going to kill you. It's the stuff that's coming with it. You know, I can find maybe that firefighters see these sort of like little bit of a grey area, whereas they'll kick back against it. But really, they shouldn't be. They should be taking it on board and getting it right, really, for themselves and their families.
As a place where we come and thinking about those that have gone before us, it's a commemoration from the city of Glasgow of firefighters. But to see it with broke on it, it really brings home the importance of what the FBU actually stand for. Fighting for members' terms and conditions, fighting for our pay, trying to get the best for firefighters for the future. Firefighters do feel broke right now, but it should be the resolve that we need to actually step up and be a united FBU that takes that fight forward, takes it to government and wins for firefighters. The fights and the battles that we have in the fire sector all do link in. And like every other sector, it's fundamentally about funding of the service. We've got a mass demo on the 27th of October. If we don't have mass membership, mobilisation outside the Scottish Parliament ahead of the decisions on the Scottish budget, then the decision makers will look at the fire service and say, the members aren't really that engaged.
If they want to see change happen, they can't wait for the politicians to do it for them. They have to stand up, they have to get together, use their collective power. And do you know what? When workers do get together, workers win.
I can only be effective in my role.
Okay, good evening everybody and welcome to FBU Scotland's Decon event. We're live from McDonald Road in Edinburgh. We are in an operational fire station, so you might hear a turnout system that's unfortunately unavoidable. I'd like to welcome you all. I'd like to welcome the audience in the room. I'd like to welcome all the members and watchers that are watching online on YouTube and on Facebook Live. And I'd like to welcome the panel. Let me introduce Professor Anna Stec from the University of Central Lancashire, who's been instrumental in the research into fire toxicology and fire contaminants. National Officer Riccardo LaTorre, who's been instrumental in the Decon project. Barry Johnston, the Regional Health and Safety Director for Region 1, and our Executive Council member, Colin Brown. Tonight, Anna's going to give us a presentation, and then once that's done, we'll open up to the floor, both here and online, for questions for Professor Stec. Anna, it's over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for your invitation. So today I'm just going to talk briefly on the firefighters and their health. Before I go any further, just a little bit about myself. I'm Professor in Fire Chemistry and Toxicology at University of Central Lancashire, which is northwest of England. I had a privilege to be a specialist on the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is in a short name IARC. World Health Organization, for those who've heard about it, they just changed category for the firefighters' cancers and their occupation to be carcinogenic, which I'm going to discuss a little bit later. I had also privilege to be a member on the US committee for the National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine, which actually look at the fire chemistry of WUI fires. And WUI fires in the novel word and novel dictionary word, which means wildland-urban interfaces, because US fires now actually taking also cities or small villages together with the wildfire. Just for anyone who's interested in that, the report is already released and it can be found on the website. And it looks generally at the fire emissions from the wildland fires, from the structural fires, and how it's combining together. It shouldn't be surprised that actually in terms of the recommendations that we found from that report, we actually don't know much. And a lot of more studies needs to be carried out to have a better understanding of the WUI fires. I was also Grenfell Inquiry scientific expert, and I was tasked really to look at the fire emissions released from the content of the flats and also from the cladding, and to identify if they travel through the building and contributed to the fire deaths. That's also released now on the Grenfell Inquiry website. Expert witness on Environmental Audit Committee that actually look at the chemicals that are commonly used, for example, as flame retardants, in upholstery furniture and or the other chemicals used in firefighters' PPE. Before we left the European Union, I was also member of or giving advice on the European Parliament on the firefighters and cancers. I'm also sitting on the ISO TC 92 SC3 committee as a member looking at exposure to fire contaminants and their effect on the human and environment. So today I'm just actually going to cover firefighter health. So we're going to actually discuss what firefighters are exposed to and also what potential effects might be. So the first kind of limitation I would say that it is that fire toxicity or the fire emissions are not regulated. We are regulating fire toxicity in transportation, but they are not regulated in any, for example, building products or anything like that. So within the emissions, we don't know what is released and what is effect on a human. And having said that, looking at the amounts of the combustible materials that are introduced to the market, that actually is increasing over the last years. And also within the number of the fires, such as wildland fires or waste fires or climate change that is affecting flooding and all of that, that's also on an increase. Firefighters' exposure to smoke, there are two major factors that are affecting the firefighter health. That would be fuel, so what actually is burning. So if we take, for example, plywood, and if we take upholstery furniture, that will release different types of emissions with different concentrations, different amounts, and it will have a different effect on a firefighter or a human. And that's also dependent on a fire scenario. So if we take, for example, smoldering fire, such as peat fire, against, let's say, structural fire, the combination and concentrations of toxicants will be really, really different. So those two factors are really going together. And then when we know the major emissions from the fire effluents, we need to look at 3 different phases, which is gas phase, so everything what is released into the air. But also, we've got toxicants which are within their chemical reactivity, they will be traveling through the distances, and we're talking about condensed phase. And finally, absolutely not discussed or touched yet, post-contamination and cleanup. So anything within the fire debris residues, and then the effect on the environment in terms of the water runoff or in terms of the soil contamination. So in terms of the fire toxicity assessment, if we're trying to predict how dangerous it would be to human, we've got some ISO standards which are looking at the fire threat to human. However, we are assessing only acute toxicity. And acute toxicity, it means immediate effect on a human. So the concentration of toxicants would be much higher, and the exposure to those contaminants is very short. And within the emergency respondents, the most interesting area is actually chronic toxicity, which means multiple exposure for a much longer time period. And if you can see, there are completely different types of toxicants. However, where you need to be a little bit careful is that if you've got, for example, hydrogen chloride is really corrosive gas, and it's really released in a high quantities from, for example, from PVC windows. That's because it's very sticky gas, will be absorbed onto particulates, and then can travel long distances and have also long-term health effect. Within the chronic toxicants, we've got quite a number of chemicals and groups of chemicals, but just to kind of the things that I'm going to focus today is the soot, that actually each firefighter can see it. And we're talking about particulates, and then particulates are made from something what I'm going to explain later on the next slide, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. I'm going to call it PAHs just to make sure that everyone can follow it. Not going into chemistry into detail, I promise. In terms of every single group of chemicals, depending on exposure, so time and concentration, those chemicals will have a different effect on a human. So if we take, for example, benzene, which is most common gas that is released from almost every single fire, we know that the most common recognized effect would be carcinogenic, leading to cancer. We've got also different types of toxins which are causing destruction of the neurological central nervous system, which would be neurological. We've got also irritants, sensitizers. So there is 7 different endpoints that those toxicants are the most common when the firefighters are exposed. I might be provocative, but I will do it later. So if we're going for the acute toxicity, if we're trying to do assessment, we're usually looking at the public, so a human health. And the first one that we're looking is, smoke obscuration. And in terms of smoke obscuration, we're looking at the impaired vision due to the smoke, so person cannot escape and cannot be evacuated during that time. While if we're taking for the chronic toxicity, from the chronic toxicity, smoke will be the soot. And the soot is usually containing carcinogens, which I will show on the next slide. Then we've got irritant gases, sticky, giving you warning they're there, pungent smell, irritating eyes, nose, throat. They're just telling you they are present in a fire. And then they will have, depending on the concentration, how much it is released. The most common example I can come up with would be hydrochloric acid, which I mentioned from PVC window. And then we've got asphyxiant gases. I might be provocative and ask audience here, what is the most common cause of death if we look for the general population? Would you consider carbon monoxide or hydrogen cyanide? Come on. Yeah, carbon monoxide. And the point that I want to make is that hydrogen cyanide is around 200 times more reactive than carbon monoxide. So when there is hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide present in a fire, the preference for replacing oxygen would be for hydrogen cyanide. The problem we've got is that within the post-mortem, hydrogen cyanide is weak acid, so it's decaying very quickly. So there is no way to confirm the presence after the death, while carbon monoxide is really stable in the blood. It's forming carboxyhemoglobin. So even days, months after the death, the level is stable. So this is the confirmation of the inhalation of the fire smoke. However, if we want to look, and I'm getting a little bit too detailed, if we look at the contribution of toxicants and prevalence of leading to the death, you can see just within the contribution, PIR, polyisocyanated foam, so kind of cladding material containing nitrogen, releasing carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide. PUR, polyurethane foam, upholstery furniture, contains polyurethane foam, but also cladding material. Phenolic foam, I just kind of put a structure of the cladding materials, extruded polystyrene, stone wool, and glass wool. PIR, PUR, they contain nitrogen. And what you can see, the contribution of hydrogen cyanide to overall toxicity is much greater than carbon monoxide, by 8-10 times more. So within the calculation, the prevalence of the gases that are emitted and having the effect on a human will be coming from hydrogen cyanide. Yeah. To explain that, what I'm just showing, FED means fractional effective dose. That's how we're using our standard to evaluate incapacitation and lethality in a human. Not emergency responders, but generally we're saying if FED equals 1, we've got probability of person dying in that condition. And as you can see, if you've got anything flaming, you will have FED higher than 1 because the concentration is much greater than actually survivability. The other point that I want to make is that if there are chlorinated species present in the fire, such as hydrochloric acid, so such as chlorine, bromine, they will actually change chemistry and they will release much higher concentrations of hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide in a fire. So if we've got halogenated, gas phase halogenated flame retardants, they will actually change it and increase the concentrations of hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide in a fire. So kind of one thing to watch it. So chronic toxicity. That's your suit. That's how it looks under the microscope. And that's how it looks, the structure. So if you look where I mentioned polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that's what you've got. You've got multiple rings combined together. And the problem we've got as a human is that we cannot metabolize it because it's got really nice structure to be very difficult to be broken. So that structure, depending on the chemical structure, it will have a different effect on a human. And usually it is classified from the carcinogenicity point, so if it's carcinogenic or not. And if we're going for any firefighter studies, most of them are based on the 16 PAHs, which are carcinogenic, probably or possibly carcinogenic. Probably and possibly means that there is not enough evidence in a human, but there is enough evidence on animals. So how it's related to the firefighter health? Within the US studies, it is found that 67 inline duty firefighters, active firefighters, actually dying from cancer. So there is kind of that exposure. The other interesting thing you should point at is 17% on cardiovascular diseases. And that 17%, actually cardiovascular diseases which are really well established from the wildland firefighters who are tackling for very long, very high exposure to contaminants, peat fires or wildland fires. And that's kind of where we've got prevalence of cardiovascular diseases. There are different ones: trauma, smoke inhalation, again, acute toxicity, burn diseases and other, but 67% is actually quite telling. So 2018, most of the studies that are done and carried out at the moment, they are done in Canada and USA, and you probably know about that. But 2018, President Donald Trump actually signed legislation which looked for correlations between firefighters' cancer and occupation. And if you go for the studies, you can find that there was Firefighters Cancer and Disease Registry set up. It's called it differently. And also they've got data exposure logbook, and also they've got NFPA created best practice guidance documents, something similar to what we've got. And then 4 years later, I had a privilege to be member of that group. International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is World Health Organization, reviewed all the evidence. So if you've got a peer-reviewed publication, scientific document, which listed across whole document, a word firefighter, we had to review it, and we had to look what actually it's talking about. Wrong way. So that took us a year to go through every single paper within the groups, and then we had a week meeting where we're going page by page and discuss every single outcome. It was pretty extensive work, and there is summary now in Lancet, which actually we found correlations between firefighters' occupation and cancer. Whole report, I would say probably it's going to be my Bible for the next 10 years. It's got 1,000 pages, just to warn you, but it's got absolutely every single aspect in relation of every single cancer and disease that it's out there studied on firefighter. So moving forward to a bit closer, I know that some of you might ask about PPE. So in terms of firefighters' PPE, there is one kind of pretty good study that opened the can of worms in terms of the protection of PPE from contaminants, which was done by the RTI, International Particle Information Studies, by kind of established institute in the US. And what they did is that they put firefighter in full gear. They filled the chamber with the particulates. They told firefighter to walk freely for amount of the time. Then they strip him down and they look if the contaminants went through his PPE. And what they found is that they found it actually particulates present on their neck, on their legs, and also in the hands. So I know that US and Canadians are pretty ahead of any testing on firefighters, but the question is how much work actually has been done in the UK? And typical question I've got, yes, should I reinvent the wheel in the UK and do the same studies that already has been done in other countries? Or should we just adopt it whatever is in? And actually, I had battle on both sides. One side told me UK is very different from the US and Canadians, and therefore we shouldn't do whatever they're saying that they should. On the other hand, someone told me you're inventing the wheel because it's really well established outside. So we actually went and did some studies in the UK. And the first studies we've done was going to a few stations doing indoor testing. So we tested fire officers, fire engines, PPE on the layers to see if there are any contaminants. And also we tested firefighter skin before and after the training, which was typical kind of container with the plywood. We learned a lot actually. So that's kind of was the basics for later on best practice, because we learned that the firefighters, when they're going for the training, they're already contaminated, which is going to be next slide. And actually the contamination is really crucial. So if you're looking at the training instructor's briefing mask, that's what it should look like. All those colors are telling you that those are carcinogens, so kind of soot precursors, which you can see on that one. And when we actually start digging in and looking at the decontamination, we found that firefighters before the training, they actually inhale quite high concentrations of particulates, which shouldn't be the case. And if you look at the amount of the toxicants they're inhaling, it was much, much greater. The other thing we learned was that firefighters' skin, front of the neck, back of the neck, jaw and hands, and you can see normally what you would expect, that firefighters should not have contamination when they're going for the training. So all that kind of graph should be actually blank. But you can see that we already detected carcinogens on their skin even before the training. And then obviously after the training, they got much even bigger. So that was posing a question, is PPE really clean if they're starting wearing it? There is also interesting study in France when the firefighters didn't go for any fire activity and they stood up in a nice summer, so quite warm, in a full gear for 4 hours, not doing any activities, just kind of standing over there. And the amount of contaminants found in a urine was like 40 times higher, which kind of told you, again, gassing off from the contaminated PPE is playing a role in terms of the exposure of contaminants to firefighters. And the other example, we did indoor testing in 2 different stations. We took samples from the offices and PPE room and appliance bay. You might ask, what's the difference between those 2 offices? Why do they have lower concentrations of carcinogens? It's just kind of pragmatic assumption that you might bring contaminants from the fire incident, and that station just opened the window and you had a fresh flow of the air coming through, removing those contaminants. Similarly, when you've got appliance bay and PPE room, we found it that if it was no ventilation in the PPE room, which was closed, you've got accumulative exposure to those contaminants that are gassing off from the firefighter kit. appliance bay, if you're opening the main door, you've got fresh air, ventilation, which is actually reducing those contaminants almost to the minimum level. So the question that I brought up after that study was actually, I was approached by Fire Brigades Union that asked me, can we find any association between firefighter occupation and cancer? Similarly, what was done in Canada and US. And my answer was at that point was that actually nothing is studied and explained and done in the UK. We obviously can adopt all the studies from US, but if we're looking at the PPE type, we've got different type. We might have different firefighting activities or different procedures, how to tackle it, decontamination and so on. So we took kind of a slow approach. And the first thing was, what actually is going on at the fire rescue services? And the best way to address it was to ask firefighters. So we ran questionnaire for 3 months. We did 64 questions. We only opened this to the serving firefighters because retired firefighters might have different experience at that point, and we wanted to know the current state. And we got around 24% of the UK firefighters workforce answering the questions. We covered 4 major points that we were interested from the contaminants perspective. Demographics, PPE, work-based contamination. So in terms of PPE, we ask the questions, how quickly you decontaminate, what type decontamination you do, how quickly you're changing your PPE, do you keep it, your PPE contaminated, not contaminated in the same location, do you split it? Health, we covered mental health and cancers specifically. And then something what was kind of expected, culture, habits, awareness of the contaminants, just from the perspective of changing, for example, culture, if that one occurred. Just to give you a flavor of the results, we found it from the answers of the survey, 84% of firefighters often sometimes attend fires without RPE. And that kind of really covers open fires. So going from anything like a small open fire, willy bean fire, to waste fire or industrial fire. If you go, what was the reason for that, you will find it habit. And I do take a point that if you've got a willy bean fire, to put BA is taking time. And a lot of firefighters told me it would be quicker to put the fire out rather than put BA. And similarly, within the other comments that we got in majority from firefighters was there is really no enforcement or policy telling us to do so. So why should I? So all that factors, just to let you know, it's going to be published in 4 peer-reviewed publications very soon, where we're actually discussing almost every single point and even more what I'm presenting today. The other thing from the fire contaminants we learned, 82% eat while in contaminated PPE. 63% eat with sooty hands. So typical estimate is that the firefighters' dominant cancer would be lungs because of inhalation, but yet BA was introduced. And what you can see is actually it's not only inhalation route, but it's actually also ingestion, swallowing the soot when you've got, for example, sooty or contaminated hands, and also dermal intake, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. The other point to bring up, only 58% firefighters change workwear on the return to the station. Next one was quite interesting. Badge of honor associated with practices leading to contaminant exposure. So those who express badge of honor attitude, they said also that they never ever clean PPE. They also said there is in a station doesn't have designated locations for the dirty, contaminated and clean PPE. And there is absolutely no awareness on the contaminants, something that it's easy to be changed and introduced. That one actually tells you a bit. If you go for do you think the badge of honor attitude exists within the fire rescue service, you've got only 15% saying, yes, I do believe it, that it exists. But 46% is just saying, yes, others believe it, but not me. Which kind of gives you attitude towards the contaminants, also badge of honor. Then a little bit on the health and mental health and the factors that are affecting mental health. That's going to be also covered in the other publication that is coming out. So the stars are telling you the data when we compare to general population to see if the firefighters have higher prevalence of developing those disorders. And for those such as anxiety and depression, you can see really big extrapolation and big exceeding data when you compare it to the general population. That actually, with the anxiety, depression, it's caused by a lot of factors which I'm not going to discuss today. It's going to be discussed in the paper, so I'm just giving you a nice flavor what you can expect from the papers. And sadly, we also learned by the time that we ran the survey, 4% of serving firefighters have been diagnosed with the cancer at that point. So if you ask me were I surprised, I would say yes and no. No, I knew that firefighters have higher prevalence of cancers, but yes, I would expect 2 times, but not 4 times. So if we look at any other data around the world, typically cancer incidence is between 1.5, 2 times higher. So that 4 times got me a bit surprised. And if you look at the prevalence of the cancer, skin is dominant one. Skin is dermal exposure. It's through the skin. So it's not necessarily inhalation. The other most popular cancers or cancer incidence would be prostate, leukemia, and GI tract through the digestion process. Next bit depressing view, and apologies for that, it's the age when that diagnosis happened. If you go for general population, the prevalence overall for the cancer incidence is around 60, 64 years old. Firefighters got 15 years earlier, which tells you that it might be correlated with their occupation and exposure to contaminants. So that takes me actually to put all that thoughts through the survey, and we actually created that best practice I hope you're familiarized with, just to make sure that we are pragmatic. We know that financial situation of the fire rescue service is not easy. So just to be really pragmatic and find halfway over there. Interestingly, I'm quite impressed that this document was now translated into 9 international countries, including Beijing and China. We've got also 2 governments, one particularly already statement that's Polish government, accepted our best practice as a mandatory document and applying recommendations from this document by January 2023 across all the fire rescue services in Poland. We've got now Czech Republic that is picking it up as well. So it's kind of, it's quite amazing. And that also led to the FBU Decon that kind of, Riccardo can talk more about it. What we're doing next, so we've got a pretty good idea what was happening at the fire rescue services. We've got a pretty good idea on the contaminants, but the question is, yes, firefighters are exposed, but how do we know that actually what they're exposed, they're going to get to the body, and actually it will develop cancer or disease in the future? So the way that we're trying to address that is through 4 different things. Firefighters Cancer and Disease Registry, I'm not sure how many of you heard about it, but if you didn't take the part, it's for all firefighters. I know the title is a little bit misleading, but it's also for the firefighters who did not or have not been diagnosed with any cancer disease as a reference group, so we can compare the data. And through the Firefighters Cancer and Disease Registry, there are 2 aspects. One, it's going to provide us understanding on the cancers and diseases specifically related to the firefighters. And 2, for those who are registering for FCDR, through the next process, we will collect 1,000 blood and urine samples from firefighters that we're going to select from the FCDR for our testing. Clinical markers. Clinical markers are the ones that firefighters getting to the GP and saying, I'm not feeling well. So GP will give prescription or will kind of refer to the typical normal testing. And that's what we're trying to find out, because if from the next slides, you will find out that clinical markers are actually addressed to the general population, and it's really not necessarily responding to firefighters' exposures. And they're specific, quite commonly rare cancers. So we're trying to address that. And then fire effluents and their metabolites. So once we've got diagnosis of the cancer and disease, we really cannot correlate this to the occupation, which is related to the exposure to contaminants. So we're identifying specific fire effluents metabolites that are only kind of reflected by the fire or generated in the fires, and they long enough in a human body to be detected, which kind of gives us correlation to not only diseases and cancers, but also link between occupation and cancer. And epigenetic methylation, It is something extra for clinical testing, because clinical testing, so when the firefighter is going to GP, the test is done now, and it tells you now if the firefighter's got any changes leading to disease and cancer. It doesn't tell you for the future. While epigenetic methylation is telling you if DNA changed already and what is the likelihood of developing cancer and disease in the future. So that's giving you kind of probability that kind of needs to be linked with the diseases and cancers. So FCDR, just give you a flavor of what we learned from FCDR, Firefighters Cancer and Disease Registry. We already got 700 cancers and 500 diseases, which is a pretty good database to start analyzing. We obviously need more firefighters to take part in it, so I can only request nicely for those who did not take part, please take it, because it helps us to correlate and find correlations that will lead to the cancers and diseases. The things that we already learned is that if there is a cough, tiredness, sore throat, headache, that's actually the most common post-effects after the fire exposure contaminants. And for some of those health effects, we actually correlated with the higher likelihood of developing cancers, specific cancers or specific diseases. So we got a pretty good idea what the side effects. The question is for how long. So for example, how long the firefighter will have sore throat, for how long the firefighter will have a headache. And that can be really related to the likelihood, again, for developing cancers or diseases. Sadly, from the FCDR, we learned that only 9% firefighters had cancer detected early. That means, when I'm meaning detect early, it means fully recovered or giving a chance to fully recovered. Typically, if it's later diagnosed, the recovery chances are decreasing. So having only 9%, it's pretty bad. And then the other things that I should draw up attention to, the stages are telling you kind of what is the recovery rate. So anything above stage 2, recovery is giving you less than half chance. Stage 3 and 4 is terminal stage. So it's only like kind of a few weeks up to a month, depending on the cancer. So what we learned is that we learned the age of firefighters' diagnosis, so we know that it's much earlier. We also learned that firefighters got metastasis. Metastasis means this spread to the different organs, depending on the stage. And something what kind of gets my attention is time between diagnosis and treatment. According to NHS rule, it's supposed to be within 4-6 weeks. And you can see 11-14 weeks. Yeah, obviously our NHS is not in the best shape at the moment, but it doesn't justify it that firefighters have to wait so long for the diagnosis and treatment. So based on that, I think the things that I want to bring up that we learned so far, we know that firefighters come on a regular basis for the combination of toxicants. And one of my ideal question was, can I identify specific exposure from wildland firefighters to waste fires and structural fires, because they will have a different fuel, so different combinations of toxicants, so different types of cancers. Forget about it. Most of the firefighters are attending all types of the fires. So it will be really difficult to distinguish which one. Definitely we learned that firefighters got detection of the cancers or cancer incidents much earlier compared to general population. Having said that, it's not only that, but they've got also metastasis, which is spread to different organs. And we also learned that inhalation is not the only major route of the exposure for the contaminants. We've got also dermal and ingestion. So where are we going with that? Changing habits, culture, that's pretty big one. Awareness, that will help to change the culture and also make firefighters think about it, whatever they do, because at the end of the day, it's up to a firefighter to think about it and make sure that firefighter can protect himself a bit better. Something what I would say, enforcement in policy, to tell that because we are not told, we're not going to do it. Attitude to make sure that it's minimized. And preventive health screening, so we can actually protect firefighters early enough to detect and get chances of the high recovery for firefighter. So on this one, I think, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. That's incredibly sobering incredibly sobering, really, really concerning to watch that. And when I think about my early career, I'm horrified, and I'm very concerned about myself and my colleagues that I started with and worked with. And we'll look back at some of the practices that we did regularly. It's just it's horrendous when compared to just now. Okay, we've got a number of questions that have been coming in online. Before we go to that, is there anybody in the audience that's got anything they'd like to ask Anna or any of the panel after that incredibly sobering? Stu.
So obviously the study focuses quite heavily on carcinogenics and cancers. Are there any studies taking place at the moment trying to link our job with any other diseases? Are there any known links to other diseases as well?
Yep.
Grab the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Is that working? Is that working?
Yep.
Yes, so there is a lot of studies, particularly in the US again, and Canada, on the cardiovascular diseases. They've got huge amount of the wildland fires over there and very high ratio of the heart attack and strokes in firefighters. So there is a lot of studies covering those aspects. We know also about the studies on the dehydration, so kidney diseases. That's also very common in firefighters, and there are some publications covering that. In terms of the other diseases, we know that thyroid, but that's cancer, sorry. Thyroid cancer is also quite common, but recovery is very high and it can be detected. Skin cancer, very similar. So yes, in terms of the diseases, I would come back to the diseases. Cardiovascular would be probably very highly investigated currently, and kidney diseases.
Thank you.
Just similar to follow-up from
Yep.
Stuart, can health and fitness help like stave off any of the diseases that we can get, or is it just purely like good practice from exposure to?
No, absolutely, it would help. So fitness will definitely reduce diabetes and reduce all the other effects that might enhance the disease and cancers. Lifestyle, yes, obviously too. So fitness, alcohol consumption, smoking, typical life factors will definitely affect the contribution that can have impact on the developing diseases and cancers in the future.
See, on that, Anna, I was wondering about that if you were continually exposed to contaminants through your work, but you were training hard and all the rest, does that increase your risk of that becoming carcinogenic, or would that decrease that? Can you get rid of some of these carcinogenic particulate matter through exercise, or are these things that are completely separate?
It's an interesting question. So in terms of removal of contaminants, at the moment the highest amount of the studies are on saunas, where you've got sweating and the body temperature increased by 2-3 degrees, which automatically open the pores in the skin, and the removal of contaminants is easier. However, I would say it has to be really carefully evaluated, because if the firefighter had a pretty extensive exposure to contaminants and activity during the fire, going to sauna will have a burden on the heart. So therefore, that needs to also be carefully assessed. But I would say there are some rumors saying that if the firefighter had exposure to contaminants, running, jogging, sweating will have higher prevalence of removal of the contaminants.
Apologies.
Yeah, no worry.
Thanks, Anna. Anybody else in the room? John?
Probably just for the whole panel. So what kind of best practice day-to-day activities can members take in order to maybe avoid some of the potential exposure to contaminants, or minimise the impact of those contaminants or having?
So look, a lot of that was really sobering and frightening to hear. One of the rare positives I think to take out of this, by working with Anna and our team, by discussing with FBU members from across the union, is there are activities, there are behaviours that we can take individually, collectively, to help mitigate these exposures. A lot of them are set out in the recommendations in that interim best practice report that Anna spoke about. Many of them you'll see the behaviours in the FBU's Decon campaign. Now that's got all sorts of resources to help get that message to firefighters, posters and stickers. We're now seeing all over fire service workplaces. Something I think we can be particularly proud of, by the way, because when Anna's team first done the review, it was found that 75% of FRSs didn't have anything on the walls, didn't have any sort of literature explaining these dangers or what behaviours can be taken to improve them. Now it is difficult to walk onto an FRS workplace and not see a Decon poster in the right place, a Decon sticker telling you what behaviour you can do, such as make sure you are decontaminated before you are eating, shower within an hour, how we wash what we carry, how we properly launder and clean our PPE. So there are many things that we can do as individuals, and that is one of the main and prime aims of the Decon campaign, to get that education into every single workplace in the FRS. But I will finish on this. That can only go so far. No, we can teach you, for example, let's take one, the showering as soon as you can, the shower in an hour. We can be trained on that until the cows come home. If we're starting to be left on the incident ground for longer and longer as our resources dwindle, for example, numbers dwindle, we're not able to get away to do that sort of decontamination that's needed, it becomes beyond just that individual's behaviour, and we really need to start looking at what resources, what facilities, what policies and procedures we need in place to help individuals carry those out.
Thanks, Riccardo. It kind of ties into a question from Facebook here. Would you be recommending to change and launder fire kit after every fire, like after every bin fire, car fire, grass fire? Is that something that you'd be recommending? And you talked about one of the things that was particularly concerned was to hear about the four French firefighters, or the French firefighters, when it was 40% higher. That would you recommend that after each fire that we go to the kit should be?
I think as long as the firefighter is exposed to contaminants, yes, the contamination it has to be pragmatic. Let's start from that one. That the firefighter has to think about it and make the judgment of the exposure to contaminants. So let's just give example. If we've got a bonfire and we've got a firefighter who are actually not acting with the fire but standing miles away, then I wouldn't think that the contamination is required, because that exposure is very minimized. But if the firefighter is tackling the bonfire and all of that and is exposed directly to the contaminants and he can smell it, then that's not a brainer.
Larry?
Thanks, Gus. Just on that, just as Anna's saying, it's every firefighter's individual responsibility to look after their safety, their crew's safety, and essentially when they go home as well, their families. On instance though, you're looking for your incident commander to take ownership of crew's welfare as well. So when you get incidents and you've got firefighters coming back and saying we weren't allowed to go for a shower because our incident commander said we couldn't, or we're getting kept at incident for longer than we should have been, it needs to be individuals saying we need to take ownership of that and say no, we need to go back to station and we need to get and go through a process of decontaminating until such times we've actually got policies in place through the service and operational guidance. We need to take ownership of that.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that it's us that are driving this, that the service have been dragging their heels on this Decon's been out for a year now, Riccardo, and we've still not got any policy. We've still not got any policy on decontamination when it comes to what we're talking about here with fire contaminants. It's really concerning. Got a couple other questions here. Anna, has there been any research into any research in relation to the effects of contaminants on fertility and reproductive growth?
Yes. So in the US, there is one study saying that a quarter of female firefighters will have at some stage miscarriage. And there is a higher prevalence of firefighters, and it's not only female but also male, having fertility issues and affected that. So there is, at the moment, that paper came out from US, and there is additional study that will come out very soon on the families and effects of the families from the member who's a firefighter. The problem we've got with female studies is usually it's only 4%, at least in UK. I hope I'm not wrong. around 4% of female. So you really need female participation to get anything scientifically validated. So for example, for the survey, we had around 11,000 responders, but we had around 400 women only responding to the survey. And usually all the answers is, I prefer not to say, because it is just small cohort. So if we can get more female going active and more responsive way for the survey questionnaire and that, yes, we really need more studies on that, because females are usually excluded from any studies on that.
Yeah, the next question, I think you've kind of answered it, but it's one of our reps that asked that some of the research results refers to certain cancers that are specific to men, and she's asking, has there been any research into women-specific cancers? The research refers to cancer of prostate and testicular, and that's because that was based in the survey group was predominantly male.
So we know that prevalence in female firefighters are breast cancer and ovarian cancer. But even within our studies that FBU is sponsoring, where we're going for 1,000 samples, if you want to get validated samples on female, it will be very hard to get consistent number from one place, for example, because there is just not enough female statistically significant to provide the evidence. But yes, absolutely yes, and I think it is something pick up in the US as well, to look at the cancers in female firefighters.
Thanks, Anna. The next question was around training instructors. Should they be given the same screening as operational firefighters due to the additional number of wears that they have and levels of PPE?
So US and Canadian, Americans and Canadians, they've got presumptive legislation and they've got health screening introduced, and training instructors, they've got twice a year health screening because of the frequency of their exposure, compared to the whole-time operational firefighters who's got screening on an annual basis.
Is this something that you can see happening in the UK anytime soon?
Yeah, my recommendation would be any training instructor should have more frequent checking up than whole-time operational firefighters. So if I would put any recommendation, I would say training instructors twice a year compared to the active firefighter.
Okay, thank you. Another, John?
Yeah, just on that question, so in regard to the number of sets, so in Scotland we operate typically with operational firefighters having 2 sets of PPE, and they'll use one and then they'll have another one to use when the other one's being laundered and back and forward. So just in regard to that question, just from the back of talking about training staff, if training staff are being exposed to these scenarios 3, 4, 5 times per week, in an ideal world, and I know we spoke about it, you mentioned it has to be practical application, but we're realistically looking at in these situations, these members should be changing their PPE on a daily basis. So provision us at 2 sets of PPE is just not sufficient. So I suppose the really quick way of that is consistently wearing the same PPE day in, day out that is being exposed to fires and training environments, and therefore you're putting that gear on time after time. Is that likely to have a compounded effect on your health?
We learned from the survey that training instructors usually got older age PPE, longer than 2 years old, and the damage and contamination is greater on PPE compared to the firefighters who do not attend fires as frequently. The other thing, we also learned that the cancer incidence is higher in training instructors, so anything what can be minimized, I would say yes, but I do recognize, restraints that fire rescue service has.
Does it make a difference, I think it was addressed through the slide, so operational firefighters will go to multitudes of different incidents producing, different things producing contaminants. In general, training staff will be wood, the same kind of wood being used, pallets all the time. I take it, does that make any difference to the
for me, for example, if I compare peat fires, which are different than wildland fires, peat fires are a bit worse in terms of contaminants because it's smoldering fire, so a lot of inorganic toxins coming off more than wildland flashover fires. But if I take peat fires and firefighters' protection compared to the structural fires where firefighters usually should wear BA, you will have completely different exposure to contaminants, types of contaminants and concentrations of contaminants. So I would look at differently, But if I look at overall exposure after, let's say, 20 years of the service, I know that that firefighter attended every single type of the fire. So it will be very difficult to distinguish the difference between that.
Yeah, something I've been wondering about for a long time is if we were to have respirators, firefighters aren't going to wear breathing apparatus to walk half a mile down a path to go to a pile of rubbish. It's something that, you know, whether we should or not, it just won't ever happen because it's one of those things that just practically won't happen. Are respirators, is that something that would...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, respirators can be considered, and they are considered in few different countries. So
Okay.
yes, not necessarily BA, but respirators, yes.
Yeah.
But not one off-time mask, because that fitting and the usage, it's very selective for the types of toxicants. So if I take, for example, peat fires, which is difficult, is that the filter that is permeable for specific toxins is really active for 30 minutes with the exposure concentration of types of toxins. And firefighters wearing this for 4 hours, 5 hours. So it just needs to be really properly looked and taken pragmatic view what would work the best.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Another question was signs and symptoms. Unfortunately, you know, I just heard this week of a colleague of ours who retired 6 weeks ago and 5 weeks ago found out he had Hodgkin's lymphoma. We're seeing a lot of people leave the service who look healthy, who haven't got health complaints. What can we be looking for? Are there things that we should be aware of with ourselves and our colleagues that we can be looking out for?
Yeah, I think there are symptoms that would tell a firefighter that he should start looking at it. And just to not exaggerate, but for example, firefighter, in our opinion, is someone who not necessarily want to admit that's feeling worse. So that might kind of stop him to recognize that something is going on. But at the same time, what we're trying to do with FBU is to create a package for the health screening that is purely focusing on firefighter health. So if, for example, in the future, we can have preventative health screening, it can be detected early. And if the firefighter doesn't want it or not, it is something giving him a chance to really to identify it within his attitude towards the contaminant.
Thank you, Anna. Another question was, how was the Decon, it says report being funded, but I'm assuming that the project itself, how has that been funded?
So the project, do you want to take it? Yeah, go for it.
So the short answer to Firefighters 100 lottery. A lottery sent up in the centenary year of the Fire Brigades Union out of interest. 100% of the profits go to good causes. You know, particularly here in Scotland, you've had quite a few of them. The Red Plaque scheme that members would have heard of, commemorating those firefighters that fall in the line of duty, I think is what it's most known for. But the lottery also helps communities and individuals affected by disaster. But it's also used to for research into health and welfare of firefighters. And this is where it comes. But the point that we discovered we needed this. You've heard a lot. It was in Anna's report there about how there's other countries ahead of us on a lot of issues here. How we got big gaps in research, big gaps in data, domestically. You know, meaning that sometimes Anna and her team are having to invent the wheel to make it fit domestically, and those gaps exist because no one was doing this, no one was funding this, no one was doing this work. So I think that's something Fire Brigades Union members can be really proud of, that we've managed to fill that gap. And if we look about where the project goes next, there is a bit of an elephant in the room, an elephant in the sector at the moment. We heard it there. IARC, a body of the World Health Organization, has categorized our occupation as carcinogenic. One of the possibly most significant safety developments in our sector's history. We are not hearing about it anywhere other than from the Fire Brigades Union, this project from Professor Stec's team. So there's lots more work to do now, and that requires funding. So yes, we will be putting the demands on the people whose duty it actually is to be funding this research, whilst keeping a very close eye on how it's done. But ultimately, in the short term, it's us. So we need as many members, as many supporters, as many family members to be playing that Firefighters 100 lottery as possible, so we can continue to commission this independent, fantastic work by Professor Stec and her team, and whatever other area we need to look into as well.
Yeah, thanks, Carlo. Another question we've got here, the SFRS estates, to do with the estate and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, the state that some stations are in, with not having running water, etc. How can the service implement the principles of Decon to keep firefighters safe when we've got so many stations in such a bad state of repair, whether it be the stations, the small amount that don't have running water, but then you've got stations, in city centre Edinburgh that are woefully, that are still being held up with, acroprops and stuff. Colin?
Yeah, thanks, Gus. As Anna's touched on, it's a pragmatic approach. We recognise that the service can't wave a magic wand, fix stations that are 80 years old where firefighter cancers weren't really considered at that time. The estate is ageing. There's numerous reports now. The Daily Record had an article on this recently about the state of the stations. We recognise that. That was one of the reasons that we took 500 firefighters plus outside the Scottish Parliament last week to demonstrate that we require funding into our service to modernise our stations, to modernise the estate, to fund all of these aspects, and not just pay, but all these elements require fire service to be funded properly. We're not in a position as a service, and I speak on behalf of the service there, albeit I'm the EC member for the Fire Brigades Union. They are not in a place to be able to change the stations overnight, so we have to change our behaviours. But we have to campaign, and we have to keep putting that pressure on politically, and that requires all our members to be involved in that, to absolutely take that to government at both levels in the UK, for members in Scotland, and make the case that we require that funding into our service.
Absolutely. I think this is kind of like the final nail in the coffin for the resistance to investment in the fire service. When we present this to the Scottish Government tomorrow, once they know. Somebody has to do something. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, when we present to them on Thursday, that high level of management have to take this. They have to look at this, and they have to start making some changes. Because the fact that we've not got any policy, we've not got procedure, we've not got enforcement incidents, we've no policy on reliefs. We're getting incidents that are over a certain size incident, and this all just falls away. None of this gets put into practice. So, going to another question from Facebook, from Heather on Facebook. Is there scope to survey and track cancer progression in retired firefighters who may be more likely to develop cancer in later age than current serving firefighters? That'll be part of the registry, I would think.
Yes, that's part of our study. So we've got funding from FBU to screen and do all that screening that I mentioned in terms of epigenetic, clinical, for the biochemistry, cancer biomarkers, fire effluent metabolites for 1,000 firefighters, where it's split it between firefighters tackling different types of the fires. It's female firefighters and retired firefighters and training instructors. So yes, we're covering the major aspects that we're aware that there are issues, especially having in terms of the health outcomes. So retired firefighters, we've got pretty big database for that as well.
Okay, and that's again kind of reiterating the importance of us signing up to the cancer registry, isn't it?
Yes, that's cancer registry, where we've got again any retired firefighters, including those who have been diagnosed with the cancer diseases, because when we can collect blood and urine, we can compare to those firefighters who haven't been diagnosed with it to see the changes that are leading for it. So it's better explanation, better scientific evidence.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Mike on Facebook is asking, what is the risk level of my colleagues and I taking these contaminants into our homes and also exposing members of the public whilst carrying out PDI, home fire safety visits and community safety events in their own homes?
There is enough evidence showing that contaminants are brought to the home, and there is evidence showing that family members have also cancers incidents. In terms of, and that's particularly for the volunteer firefighters, that's already published in the US literature, and now it's going a very big project in the US. I think, if I'm not wrong, a CDC NIOSH. that is looking particularly at the health outcomes in children and the family members from the firefighter who's kind of bringing contamination to home.
It's really concerning. You talked about Poland have taken the document that the Fire Brigade Union produced with yourself, and they've taken that and they're enforcing that.
Yes.
They're actually enforcing the...
Yes. It was voting in the government, it was voted for adoption, and it's got all the legal binding that those recommendations adopted by January 2023.
And we are doing nothing. Are we being fought at the sort of senior levels of government in this country and in the UK in general? Is that what you've found, Carlo?
I think I'll leave it to Riccardo. I'm just a scientist, sorry.
We've been clear from the start of this. We've got three strands of this campaign of this project. One is those individual behaviours that we discussed. The question from the audience there: what can we do? What do FBU members do best? We look after each other. We just spoke about this isn't just for us as well. It's going into our homes potentially. So what can we do collectively to change our behaviours to help minimise these risks? As we've said, that only goes so far. Then we need to start looking at, okay, what should the employers be doing? What demands do we need to be placing on them regards systems of work, policy and procedure? There's then the further strand of that. We're not going to eliminate this for everyone, no matter how hard we try. So those firefighters who still fall ill, to still succumb to some of these diseases, what support is in place for them regards legislation? How can we look after these firefighters once they become ill? And that's where we have to start discussing with politicians and ministers. We're doing it tomorrow in Scotland. As you know, Gus, we're taking the argument to the relevant ministers in all areas of the union, but as yet we are coming across the closed doors. We're not quite getting back the message we'd like to hear. The General Secretary, Matt Rack, wrote to all departments and ministers with responsibility for fire and for health on the recent IARC decision, and the responses have been disappointing, to say the least. So we have the science now. We have the evidence from Professor Stec and her team. Yes, there's more we still need to gather, but now we have it. That's down to us. That's down to FBU members, the trade union, our campaigning, industrial and political campaigning to stand up demanding this to those who have the responsibility to provide it. Because as yet we're just not there. And as we've heard of the legislation that exists in other parts of the world, particularly Canada and the US, we are far behind. And as long as we're far behind, firefighters and their families are being seriously let down, and we have to campaign for change on that.
Yeah, thanks, Carlo. Yes.
Now that the World Health Organisation's carcinogenic occupation, will it become not only a moral obligation but a legal responsibility for employers to tell all new employees that, or people applying, that is the case, and that the chances of them getting cancer will be increased through employment? So interestingly,
a year before IARC gave announcement for the direct correlations and firefight occupation and cancer classified as firefight occupation classified as carcinogenic. In England, we had Industrial Injury Advisory Committee that is deciding on the compensations and presumptive legislation, and they did literature review worldwide, and they didn't find any correlation between firefighter and occupation and cancer. So I do not know if they're going to revise that evidence now based on the WHO recommendations, but I'm just a scientist.
And I think that's important, because that what shows right now that domestically we're out of step with the World Health Organization. That can't be annoyed. So it's those revisions that we need to now be campaigning for, demanding for, because there is research now that exists that didn't at the time of that last review. So there's now the sort of political campaigning that FBU members need to collectively take up, and we're going to keep an eye on the campaign, because we're going to be very loud and clear about how we take those next steps very soon.
Thanks, Riccardo. Anybody else? Stu first.
So Obviously, this is a fight that's going to have to be fought on a lot of different levels, but is there anything that our members can push for now for the employer that could have high impact at relatively low cost for them? For instance, introducing respirators when we're tackling fires, or things like that, or would it be better to focus on better welfare facilities for fires, quicker access to washing facilities when there've been incidents, better laundry facilities, for instance?
So I'll hand over to Anna for the science, but in the short term, what we can have members demanding of their employers is that the best practice document is adopted, supported wholeheartedly in every FRS, and I'll let Anna explain why.
Yeah, I just wanted to steal from that, but you covered that. I think where you really have the biggest chance to do change is to enforce it. So bring it as a policy that it's not giving a choice firefighter to tackle contamination. And something what I would say changing the culture is awareness, training, and making sure that you're aware of your occupation.
Thanks, Anna. Mikey?
Yeah, there was a recent study in America about firefighter PP, and there was harmful PFAs.
Oh, that's right.
And is that study been, have they got similar kit to ours, or is that study coming here? Or?
Right. So PFAS at the moment, they are in firefighter gear. They are in firefighting foams. Some of the chemicals were banned currently to be used in firefighting foams. So as far as I'm aware, Fire Rescue Service should replace them for the healthier option. But I don't know how it's going to be verified and checked, knowing that the organization that should look at it, they don't have resources. In terms of the firefighting gear, I think in the US, Fire Rescue Service or International Organization for Fire Rescue Services brought it up to the court to ban those chemicals to be used in a firefighter gear. So I don't think anything is covered in the UK. Mostly it's done, again, in the US on perfluorinated chemicals. However, there were reports on perfluorinated chemicals in cosmetics and daily products quite commonly in the UK. And we have...
and we now have conference policy. It was so the debate around the Decon campaign and this research was really good to hear, to be fair, at conference this year, how engaged, how high on the agenda this issue is for FBU members, and how engaged and informed and our delegates at conference that were on it. And one of the resolutions passed was for us to now to expand our project to start looking at that and fill those gaps where that research isn't being done. So that's a discussion we're going to be having about how we now proceed to do that. But he's very much on the agenda of the union and this campaign.
Thanks, Riccardo. Anyone else in the room? John?
I had a question about the retained, but just on the back of a couple of last questions you've been asking. What are the potential implications on employers? So we're obviously moving to a stage now where there's now medical evidence or research that indicates that there's clear links between septic illness, cancers, and as you've been speaking about tonight, what are the potential implications for employers as we move year on year if they fail to adopt some of the principles of Decon? We know there are some fire rescue services in other parts of the country that are in some ways taking quite an antagonistic approach to Decon, asking for posters to be taken down from workplaces, etc. I know that's not a situation that we have in Scotland, but is there a real onus on employers here? I mean, ultimately they're funded publicly, this is a public's money. What are the potential implications? Are we moving potentially into a direction similar to some of the asbestos campaigns and some of the compensatory legislation that moved on the result of that? I know we may be a fair distance away from that, but what ownership have the employers got of this, and potentially what are the implications for them down the line?
I mean, it's a good question. It's very difficult to answer because, as we've seen recently with enforcement of health and safety laws becoming very difficult at the moment, with the strains and the cuts that we've seen on the enforcement agencies in particular. Right now, it appears no implications because the onus is very much on the individual to prove that they've caught that disease or that cancer as a result of their occupation. That is after the event, which is incredibly difficult, if not impossible to do. Obviously, what we're trying to achieve is that burden has to be going to the employer to prove that we didn't catch it from the occupation. But it's going to come down to us filling these gaps and we need all members to pull together on this, because I think it's been stressed there in Professor Stec's presentation. We need the data, we need the information, we need the sample sizes. And then it's down to us to make sure that we leave no stone unturned, and our employers and bosses can't hide anywhere else. Because as we've seen with other safety issues, recently within our industry, let's look at the BA safety campaign, for example. It's getting very hard to get these matters enforced. When we saw some of the scandalous risk assessments out there by fire and rescue service employers through the COVID pandemic, it's getting very hard to get these issues enforced. It often comes down to us trade union members acting and campaigning collectively to make these demands heard, and it's looking that's what we're going to have to do on this issue.
If I can pick it up, there was interesting debate in the US about it, and actually it's always at the end of the conversation, it's how much it's going to cost. So the evaluation that was done was against how much it's going to cost to do health screening for firefighter to early detect it, against the cost that is going to cost the firefighter with the cancer, recovery, and being away from the work. And they found it that actually, and that's where some states introduce it, health screening is much better option, and within all the costings. So where we're going in the future, I would say ideally, kind of with my humble scientific hat on, I would say if we can introduce health screening, we're definitely going to reduce the cost for the suffering of firefighters.
Thanks, Anna. Just on that, can we request cancer screening through the NHS? Is there a way that we can go and ask for that without having specific symptoms?
So according to my knowledge, at least in England, GP can do screening on an annual basis for anyone who's coming and saying. The problem with the GPs at the moment is that GP doesn't have in a record that it's firefighter occupation, and or actually firefighter might suffer or got prevalence in terms of disease and cancers. So GPs do not know what to test for. And that's something what we will address through the FBU project. We've got 3 clinical managers at Royal Preston Hospital, and we've got also national clinical lead that's got access to the GP's templates, records, and all of that. So we're trying to change the template that if the firefighter is coming, you will have firefighter occupation or occupation that's supposed to be listed or supposed to be told. So when you're coming to GP and saying, I'm firefighter, GP can quickly pick it up what should be tested for.
Okay, thanks very much. John?
Just a question regarding maybe specifically to retained firefighters, so on-call part-time firefighters. So half the workforce in Scotland is made up of retained firefighters. There's other brigades throughout the UK that have high levels or similar proportions. So to me they seem particularly at risk of potentially taking contaminants home with them.
Yep.
Or back to their workplace. They get called out, leave their workplace, go to an incident, return either to their workplace, or go home, play with their children, whatever. So I suppose it's a couple of fold question for all of the panel. From Professor Stec in regard, what is that risk, or what do we know about that risk of our members taking these contaminants back home or back onto their full-time workplace? And for the rest of the panel, it's what do they see, particularly in Scotland, maybe for Barry and Colin, what do they see as the risks there? Because we touched on earlier about how we have workplaces in Scotland that are effectively little better than a shed, don't have adequate washing facilities. We have some workplaces that are as little as being a trailer. So what options are there for members who attend incidents, come back and don't have a workplace where they can decontaminate properly, and the potential risks on the back of that in regard to taking it home to either their workplace or their family?
So answering your first part, it's actually a very interesting question that if we look at the IARC correlations with the firefighter occupation and cancer, it's including all types of firefighters. That includes fire investigators, that includes volunteer firefighters. They treat it equally. So the risk is the same as you would have wholly operational firefighter. For the second part of the question, I would say that if you've got, and I just forgot what was the second part. I'll leave it to Riccardo and I'll come back with the second part.
Yeah, that second part, John, for me, our on-call RDS firefighters are at significant risk here, because that principle of shower within an hour isn't afforded to them on a lot of their stations. So this has to be a campaign priority for us as the officials in Scotland and FBU National, but also for members to apply that pressure within the service and politically. It comes down to behaviours. What the FBU campaign's done and the education part of that campaign, firefighters have to adopt every element of it that they can. Bag their kit post-incident, let it gas off, have changed the clothes at their stations so they're not, going back in the same clothes to their workplace or to their homes, taking every available measure to them whilst we apply that pressure to have facilities upgraded to the point where they can actually apply the principles of shower within an hour and every other aspect of this. So there is a pragmatic approach. The argument of it's simply down to we can't afford to keep firefighters safe at work, that's going to wear thin very quickly because they are an employer and they have a legal obligation to do so. So that's where the campaign for us has to be.
Thanks, Colin.
Just elaborating. So I sit on the contaminants group for FBU through the service. We had a meeting earlier on today with Anna and Riccardo, and it was a good meeting. And as I say, I sit on the group anyway, and all these issues are brought up, and the service are fully aware, as Colin's touched on. So yeah, we just need to continue our best practices, follow that, and it is a culture change for a lot of firefighters to follow these practices. But it's within our best interest individually and as a crew going back to the station, as Colin's saying, just being prepared, having that spare kit available to change into your undergarments and what have you, and washing facilities. Obviously, in some stations it's not available, and that's something the service need to address. There's other things we can do though, like at incidents. There's a process we should be following at debriefs at incidents if things don't go well, like such as welfare. There's no facilities, or we're not getting the time to decontaminate, or we're getting sent to another shout when we're actually just been at a shout. These things need to be raised through the debrief process, through OA channels, so that the service have that data, and when we go back to the service and say, well, we have these incidents and we're not following these processes. Again, there's not a policy in place just yet, but through the contaminants group they are working on that, and a lot of good work getting done through the contaminants group. But obviously we want to see things happening at a quicker pace, and that's what we'll be putting pressure on them to do.
Thanks, Barry. John?
Just a follow-up to that, so just on the back of it, how big a part of what members can do now are changing cultural behaviours? And two parts to that. So what responsibility do members have to try and take actions when they're contaminated, an incident, just to protect their own safety, that of their colleagues that they work with? And secondly, as well, how big an impact does, and Riccardo touched on shower within an hour, how big an impact does getting our members away from an incident where they've had significant exposure to fire, contaminants with that fire, how big an impact is the time frame within them then being able to decontaminate? And I suppose specifically leading on to that, maybe getting into some of the panel members from Scotland, particularly around relief crews. Relief crews being an issue that continually comes up in Scotland over the last 5 or 6 years. The ability for us to remove our members who are exposed to incident at the very start, who are in BA, who are extinguishing the fire, who are rescuing casualties, who are right at the coalface at that starting point, and the ability to get them away from that incident in quick time and get them to within the station. So I suppose for Anna, what sort of timescales in an ideal world are we looking at doing that? And how big a part of that is then a cultural part of the organisation? So the cultural part for our members, an activity you can do to look after yourself now and your colleagues. The cultural part for the service on the incident command ground and actually getting people away from incidents. And for Anna, how important is that? How important is it that we get people away from these incidents as quickly as possible, and how big an impact can that maybe have for the data we've got and the impact it has and how they're affected by contaminants?
I think there were two questions in there, and I'm not sure if.
Don't worry. Don't worry. I remember. I remember them now.
I got lost halfway through. So you're a professor, though.
Yeah. To answer your first question, what members can do? Look at that. If you're aware and you've got a colleague who doesn't care, like you've got really nice reflection on the graph. I'm not doing it because others are not doing it. I'm told not to do it. I'm not bothered. That's the first point. If you are aware of contaminants, you can make a change, and you can make a change to your colleagues who are going with you. So my first quick change would be, be aware, be pragmatic, but be aware of contaminants and try to minimize it. You'll never ever remove it, but you can minimize it, and you can influence others to do the change. So that would be my first answer. The second answer, forgot.
I know the feeling.
Sorry for that.
Yeah, on the relief crews, the ability to remove people, from instance, follow the principles of the Decon, that's a massive challenge. We have the largest landmass of any fire and rescue service of any region in Scotland. We have the most spread out geography. We've got island communities where it's very difficult to get relief crews there without planes, trains, automobiles, ferries and any other means of transport. So there is significant issues with that. But the more significant issue is, and without getting overly political about this, we've just been informed that the potential budget for the next 4 to 5 years could strip 780 firefighters out of Scotland. So that impacts our ability to have relief crews attend an instance. It has a massive impact on our ability to do all aspects of our role. Publicly we think that's an impact on incidents because it's going to be longer response times. But for firefighters, it's a massive impact on our health and safety because we're going to face that exposure for longer without the ability to relieve firefighters who have been first in on an incident. So the challenges on this are huge. And again, without harping on about the funding element, this is where it comes to. The behaviours are absolutely fundamental for firefighters to change that culture. And as Anna's research has shown, we need to change mindset on this. But we need to change government mindset on this as well. That it's not just about what we do day to day. It's about the ability to actually have a meaningful response and protect firefighters at their work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Colin. I've got a few questions that come from Facebook. One that's probably tied into what we can do. Somebody asking if the SFRS face masks are up to the job, is that the level of cover? Is that level of cover the bare minimum? So we use FFP3 masks.
I know. Right. The way I would respond it is that it was heavily discussed in the open text box from our survey. So we had 12,000 respondents and we had around 4,700 discussion from firefighters talking about it. So we summarized the points in the paper that will come out on it. But generally, I know it's fitting, takes time. I know they're not comfortable. I know they're blocked very quickly. I know that some of them will not actually work actively, particularly if it's very high exposure and very high concentrations of the smoke, because they're going to be blocked very quickly. We're aware of that, but if you ask me what is the solution, I would just need to go and test all the options over there, so to make any scientific judgment what's better out there.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other questions in the room? Because I've got a few more from online.
Nope.
Ronnie from Cruto?
Oh, they've been answered.
Oh, they've been answered. Excellent. Okay, we've got 3 questions here about the transportation of kit. So firefighters are being detached from one station, going and working at a different station. And there's a few questions about transportation of kit. We've got bags that should be sealed, but is there, when you talked about that, the French firefighters and the gassing off of kit, is that something that you would suggest we shouldn't be doing?
No. So in terms of the transportation, bags, the PPE should be bagged and sealed, and the best way keep outside of fire engines. So I'm kind of probably, I shouldn't say that, but if I hear fire engines, I'm actually looking where are the gloves and helmets when the car is passing by or engine is passing by, and I still find that the gloves are just in front of the wheel. So I would say that anything after the fire incident should be packed and kept outside of the interior of the fire engine and properly sealed. And then there are washable bags as well that you can put directly to the washing machine and clean it, but please make sure that you separate them to not have cross-contamination, if that's answering the question.
That answers the question, yeah. The question was also about the transportation of fire kit within people's private vehicles. If they're going from one station to another, going home and then going back to their home station.
Still the same. Should be packed as soon as quickly, as sealed as properly as they can, and keep it in additional box that can be removed, so it doesn't have any contact with the surfaces inside of the car. Ideally, it shouldn't be in a car, but if that's no solution, then yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Colin?
On that specific point of transportation of kit, getting your kit to the job, it should be clean, because it should have been laundered after your last incident. Taking your kit away from the job, if it's contaminated, bag it, doesn't go near your personal vehicle, doesn't go in the back of the cab in a pump. It is put in a locker, bagged. It should not be transported within the bags that were issued by the service. That's for clean kit to be in. Any contaminated PPE should be sealed bag, sent for laundering. It should not be transported in any environment or any vehicle, cab, car, otherwise, that firefighters or their families, horrendous to even think that firefighters would do that still, and that's the cultural part. It should be bagged, and that is the service policy, that the PPE leaves the incident and goes for laundering. It doesn't return to home address or back to station and get hung on a peg. And the gloves part is something that I think we all, as firefighters, need to change our culture on. We regularly will launder our PPE, as in our tunics and leggings, but how often do we wash the inside of our helmets? How often do we launder our gloves or replace our gloves? You know, you'll have firefighters putting the same gloves on incident after incident and not having that link to the absorption through their gloves. So it's something that we need to change the culture on as well.
Absolutely. I think it was the concerning thing with one of your slides about pre-training, that people firefighters were going to training centres already contaminated.
I can only refer to the paper, because we also discussed what is the percentage of the responders who are actually cleaning the gloves. Not much.
Yeah.
And how actually, what is the look like of the gloves when they are used and how often they are cleaned. It's giving a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think we're probably all guilty of that. Still on the laundering of kit, Chris at Dunfermline's been asking, laundered kit still has contaminants present. How can we expect it to transport this kit without then having to decontaminate our vehicles? I think that's wrapped up in that last question, that if it's contaminated, it shouldn't be in your vehicle, but we know that there are contaminants on kit that probably looks clean, and that's maybe something that we need to be looking at culturally. And on the contaminated kit, Rick on Facebook's asked, would dirty gear have the potential to contaminate all gear on station if not laundered? And if so, is there a way for individuals to test their fire gear, as it's difficult to know if it's been exposed to others' contaminated gear on our days off? And I know what he's referring to, that some people, some watches are maybe more hot on this than others. Some people hang their kit up without sending it away for laundering, next to people who are much more aware of the training.
Yeah, I think that leads me to enforcement, and just say that shouldn't happen. I would say first separate clean and dirty, and if you're bringing anything dirty, that should be packed and not in the closeness or getting closer to anything that's clean. So I would say enforcement and making sure that it's not happening. Sorry.
No, absolutely. Colin, Barry.
I was just going to say, yeah, that again, that's a cultural thing. You shouldn't be walking into a locker room and smelling smoky, dirty kit. It should be getting decontaminated at incidents, and that has to be something that's enforced through shifts, through cultural change and behaviours.
I think a big part of that will come with the zoning. Once we implement the zoning that we're looking for, as in, you know, dirty and clean areas where contaminated kit doesn't cross, then contaminated kit should never be near a kit room. It's that simple. But it is that culture change, but the enforcement needs to start. You know, these changes require leadership, and it requires, as Anna's touched on, the enforcement to come from incident commanders, and in this case, on that specific point, be a top-down approach if the culture's to change, because it requires instruction sometimes to get firefighters to comply with things.
Absolutely. Again, it comes back to the point of policy, that we need policy on this stuff. And I think we've got one last question, which I think ties into the question that didn't get answered with John's last one about length of times at incidents and relief crews. We've got a current standard in some parts of the country where it's a sort of 4 to 6 hours that you'll be expected to be at a job, and this is still part of the thinking. In one half of the country, that's enforced that in 4 hours they get people away and relieved. Over this side of the country, you know, recently the wildfires, we're seeing firefighters out for 14, 16, 18 hours in the same fire kit. Would you say there's a length of time you should be in and away from? If you're the first BA team in, would you suggest you go straight back to your station, decontaminate, shower, all the rest of it?
I'm just going to smile and give you a scientific answer. In terms of the contamination, that will depend on the length, types of the chemicals that are taking part in the burning, and the concentrations. So all those three factors will have an impact how badly firefighter might be contaminated. But one thing that should be really clear is as soon as the fire incident is finished, just get personal decontamination as soon as that's possible.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Yes.
Just on the back of that, if you want more out of a tactical incident and you need 5 round feed, is there a way of mitigating that? Because obviously ingestion is a high cause of cancer.
So I don't remember which country we introduced, and it's again resources that we're starting questioning, is that they've got mobile van with the showers, and they're also bringing wipes and all the other types of the contamination that minimize it, but it's coming back to the resources.
Okay, if there's no more questions in the room and there's nothing else online, I'd just like to thank you massively, Anna, for the research you've done.
Thank you for your invite.
And to Riccardo for the work that you're doing, and thank you to all the members that have contributed to this through the 100 lottery. Thanks to Barry and to Colin for being on the panel, my beautiful assistants at the side here, and for everybody who took part here. It's the most important thing I've seen in my career. And I just hope that we can start to drive the cultural changes that are needed from the bottom up, and I can assure every member who's watching this that we'll be taking this to the government tomorrow, we'll be taking it to the senior levels of the service tomorrow, and making it absolutely clear that this needs to be at the top of their priority list like it is ours. Is there anything else you want to finish with, Anne or Riccardo or the panel?
No, I can only say for those who did not take part in the cancer registry, please register, because we can then have a better data and better protection.
Absolutely. We'll do our best to push that again and continually through our structures. Okay, people, thanks very much for your attention.
Hi and welcome to another video update from the Fire Brigade Union, here in the Union's head office in Kingston, London. 4th of February is World Cancer Day, and we're joined by National Officer Riccardo LaTorre to speak about the Union's Decon campaign, which of course deals with this issue. Now Riccardo, we launched Decon in September last year. What's been happening since then? Can you give members watching an update?
Of course, we're so pleased with how this project has taken off since we launched it on 6th of September live from a fire station, and more importantly the messages we've been getting from members loud and clear how important this issue is, how high up the agenda for firefighters understanding this link and doing something about it is. We've seen the engagement in every corner of the FRS. We're seeing the posters going up, we're seeing the tweets, we've seen people with their babies wearing Decon stickers. The training is being taken. The pledge is being signed, and we're getting requests for more information, more posters, all of the time. We're also seeing the registry that we've launched starting to be filled out by firefighters, and we're seeing that data build up so we can understand even more going forwards about this link between cancer and firefighting, which we know affects everyone in the fire rescue service in one way or another.
Now, you mentioned the Firefighters Cancer Registry. It's a huge part of getting the really vital data. But one of the questions we keep getting asked, is the registry for firefighters who've already been diagnosed with cancer, or should all serving members fill it out?
Look, I can't be clearer on this, Tam. We need every single firefighter to fill out that registry. Whether you've been diagnosed with a cancer, whether you've been diagnosed with a disease, or if you've never been diagnosed with anything, we need you to fill out that registry. Now, we've said throughout this project, the launch in September was only the start. There is so much more we need to understand about the link between cancer, disease and the occupation of firefighting. Now, we mentioned in the launch, we heard from colleagues and comrades from abroad how other parts of the world are ahead of us on this issue. You know, they understand more. And the reason they understand more than us is because they have the data. And they get that data from registries such as the one the Fire Brigades Union has now launched together with the University of Central Lancashire. We cannot protect ourselves from this danger if we don't properly understand it, and we can't properly evidence it, and we simply cannot do that unless firefighters fill out that registry. So I'll repeat it because it's so important. Whether you've been diagnosed with a cancer or whether you're completely healthy, if you've been to specific incidents, we've got statisticians and scientists and toxicologists monitoring this data, and they're finding it particularly interesting from incidents such as Grenfell. They're finding that data really, really helpful. Every single firefighter needs to fill this out, and they need to fill it out quickly so we can start this life-saving work that we need to be getting into place.
Well, no, absolutely. But it's not just the registry, is it? I mean, Decon has got a number of initiatives that members can get involved in. Can you speak about that? What else can members do to involve themselves in the campaign?
Absolutely. And in the short term, the most important thing members and firefighters can do is take the training. They can find the training on the Fire Brigades Union website. They should talk to their FBU health and safety rep to find out if it's being delivered by their fire and rescue service yet, which many fire and rescue services are doing, I'm pleased to say, through their official training. If the posters aren't up, get the posters up around your workplace, not just on the health and safety board. Get them in the relevant parts of the station where we need to be reminded most about what it is we must be doing to keep ourselves and each other safe. As we've already mentioned, fill out the registry as a priority. This project is continuing. We need that data. Fill out the registry as a priority. And when I say the project is continuing, we've said throughout, we said it from the launch, this is just the start. There's more we need to understand and there's more we need to do. We're expecting more research to be published very soon as a result of this project by University of Central Lancashire, commissioned by the Fire Brigades Union. And it's going to change the way we look at firefighting. It's going to change the way we look at the risk presented to us as firefighters by these toxic fire effluents. So keep an eye on the Fire Brigades Union social media, keep an eye on the Fire Brigades Union website, because there's more coming very soon, and we will be informing members